Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
Hello, Economic Rockstars, and welcome back to another episode. And in this week's show, I interview a duo who happen to be a husband and wife, Steve Horwitz and Sarah Skwire. And if you're a long-time listener of the podcast, you might recognise these names as they have featured previously. Steve Horwitz featured in episode 108 and Sarah Skwire featured in 129. And I didn't even realise that they were married. It was only toward the end of the interview with Sarah Skwire that she mentioned that she was married to an economist. And I inquired a little further and lo and behold, it was Steve Horwitz. And it was prior to this interview with Sarah when I reached out to her first back in episode 129 that I asked would she come on a second time so we could do something on writing. And I was delighted that she agreed, and it was only recently that we began to make arrangements. And I decided why not have Steve join us in this interview, which they gratefully decided to come on. So this episode is over 90 minutes in duration. And we had a casual and a comfortable conversation regarding writing, the writing process, whether you're an academic or an author, or somebody who might have a blog. And I had a number of questions that I wanted to ask Sarah and Steve, but I just let the conversation develop naturally and I asked those questions when they came. So Sarah and Steve shared a number of tips, some of their habits in which how they approach their writing, how they keep their desk, what time of the day they best write at, as well as how to deal with reviews and resubmissions for those of you who are into academia and have to face the peer review process. Hopefully I'll have this episode out soon on YouTube as I filmed it, and I'll break the video up into smaller sections so that we could address those questions and answers. So this episode with Sarah and Steve is completely unedited and it's a raw file, so all I did was adjust it for sound because I wanted to capture the natural conversation that was going on between us. So let me know if you've noticed anything different regarding the edited versions, which I do spend quite a bit on in the previous episodes compared to this episode, which is completely unedited. And if you want to join a conversation and add to anything that we've discussed today, why not check out economicrockstar.com/Sarah and Steve, and you can add to the comments on that particular blog page, or why not check me out on Twitter, econ_rockstar. Check out my Facebook page, Economic Rockstar, or on Instagram, Economic Rockstar. I'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you. And if you're a writer, be it in economics or any other discipline, or in fiction or non-fiction, and you'd like to be on this podcast to add to this, please give me a shout over at economicrockstar@gmail.com and we might put a show on together. You can check out all the links and resources mentioned by Sarah and Steve over at economicrockstar.com/Sarah and Steve. And if you've missed any of the previous episodes, why not check out economicrockstar.com/podcasts to check out all episodes that are available. If you're on Apple Podcasts, why not subscribe and leave an honest rating and a review. For everyone else, you can find me on Spotify or on my own website, where you can actually download the episodes, keep it for another time to play, or you can play away as you browse the site. If you're a fan of the podcast and would like to support the show, why not check out my Patreon page over at patreon.com/Economic Rockstar, where you can support the show for as little as $1 per month. There are other tiers available where you can support the show for $2, for $4 plus. And again, sharing is caring, so I would love if you could share this episode or any other previous episode that you like with somebody else that you know could appreciate listening to the same episode as you. Just find links on any of those podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or even my own website, and send them an email, copy the links and pass it on. And it's you by spreading the word that helps me organically grow this podcast and reach more listeners. So thanks again for listening to the podcast, and enjoy this episode with Sarah Skwire and Steve Horwitz.
And I read it and I thought, this is awesome. I've no idea what to do with this. I wonder if anybody knows this is a thing, right? And so I went, hey, Steve,
first person.
This really cool thing. This looks like it's got money and stuff in it. And this is like your kind of stuff, but I don't know what to do with it.
I did. So I teach an economics of gender class,
Nice.
economics of gender and family class, right? And I do a lot of history in that class, so the history of the evolution of the family and so on. So,
Can you hear me?
All right. Now we're audible, but Frank's not audible.
Go.
Oh, hang on.
Yeah, drop there. Yep. Yep. Now,
There we go. We got you.
Oh, you have me.
yeah.
Yes.
You have me. Oh, great.
Sorry. Yeah. Complete incompetence on my part. Sorry about that.
Why? What was the problem?
She never uses her speaker. She always has her headphones on, so she just forgot to. There's a little portable speaker that has to be plugged in, and Skype needed to know where we were listening from. So we got it.
As usual, my ex-husband, the IT guy, would have said, problem exists between chair and keyboard. Or it's an ID 10T error. Are you familiar with that one?
ID 10T, no. It sounds like something out of Star Wars.
No. Read closely.
You learn something every day.
Yep.
Yes, new ways to insult people, brought to you by Horwitz.
I might put that into my integrated some way into my lecture notes, perhaps.
Yeah.
There you go.
Excellent.
Well, welcome to the Sarah and Steve show. I mean, the Economic Rockstar podcast.
Well, that's what you're going to get.
Pretty much.
Well, it was great talking to you, Steve. I just looked back, episode 108, and with yourself, Sarah, it was 129, which wasn't too long ago, but I think it was 6 months ago, according to Skype, when we were last speaking to one another. But I didn't realize the connection until you mentioned it, Sarah.
I know.
You hang around with economists.
Just a little.
And I guess when I was last speaking to you, I would have liked to talked about writing, or whether any form of writing, whether it's academic or writing in terms of leisure, which I think is something that people, if you write for leisure, it takes the hard work out of it in terms of the accountability. And then, Steve, you sent me an email. There's anything else you'd like to talk about? And to be honest, I'd love to just have an informal conversation, find out a bit about you more in a comfortable surroundings. You know, you're at home. Hopefully you're relaxed, and see what comes out. And I follow Steve on Facebook, and at times he throws some wonderful gripes about what's going on around the world. I won't mention any names, but maybe we'll maybe we'll go down that road as well, if that's okay with you, Sarah. I'm sure, as long as he's not talking about you now.
Well, certainly he's never irritated me, so that's,
So how would you like to start this, or do you want to, maybe we could find out what you've been up to since?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, Steve, you've been through the mill, haven't you?
Well, yeah, I mean, in my case, since we last talked, I think it was over a year ago, right?
Yeah.
So I've been, as I think you know, perhaps been battling a cancer diagnosis since then.
Yeah.
But I'm doing great. I've been through some treatment, and I'm in remission, and I feel really, really well. So I just need my beard to grow back. That's the only thing I really need. But so that certainly has slowed my productivity down in a number of ways. But I am working on a series of projects right now for my friends at the Mercatus Center, all of which that deal with crises and how people respond to crises. And you can see how this might have come out of their work and my work on Hurricane Katrina. But they're interested in expanding that to a much larger sort of question about how the private sector, civil society, and in the case of one of the papers I'm working on, how households respond to crises, whether it's natural disasters or economic crises. And so I'm doing a bit of work on that right now, which is fun, and it was good to get back to that. And I'm still working on my monetary stuff. I guess the other thing is it should be out sometime soon. It's been delayed. I have a big project with the Cato Institute on Austrian economics, some video lectures, some audio lectures, a short kind of ebook manuscript. So all that should be out probably early next year, I think, at this point, but maybe sooner. We'll see.
Wow, that's a lot of
So-
work. And do you, like, sorry, Sarah, how do you,
Oh, no, that's all right.
where do you fit into all of this? Does he have time for you, or do you have time for him?
Well, I was going to say, so what that means basically is that Steve is more productive with cancer than most people are without it, which is a little bit daunting.
Yeah.
And
is that
so
because he's at home a lot, or, you know, maybe the realization that you have this illness that it kind of pushes you to do more in such a short space of time, or is it something different?
No, I would just say I can't be happy unless I'm working.
Yeah.
And I do think that when you have something like this, the more normal you can make your life in every other way, the better.
Yeah.
So if I were sitting at home, you know, staring at TV all day long, I would be sicker than I am now, I think. And I just had this conversation with one of the oncology nurses last week. But yeah, I think sort of getting back to your life and living your life the way you lived it, have always lived it, is one of the best things you can do to deal with the disease. So in my case, that's probably part of it too. And some of the stuff like the project for Cato, the work on that is basically done. And most of that work was done about a year ago. Some of the writing since, but so that's basically done. I'm just kind of waiting on that. The crises papers though are new work I've been doing over the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm. So I'm working right now. I'm spread out. I know my desk, which is a train wreck right now, is filled with books that I'm using for research on a paper about Shakespeare's Richard III and Elizabethan succession crisis. So that's one project that I'm working on. I'm also in a sort of an email conversation with an organization about publishing a collection of essays of mine about economics and literature.
Nice.
Just had a review of a book called Sense and Sensibility come out, which is very funny because the review came out and then about 2 days later, Steve was asked whether he would do a review of the book.
Actually, what I was asked was it whether we would co-author a review of the book. And I said to the editor, I think Sarah's already read and reviewed that. And I said, and you don't want me to write one by myself because I've already read her review. So it turns out I'm going to co-author with someone else to go fool around
with another literature professor.
Okay. So your desk is a mess, is it?
Yes, it is. It always is.
But
and of course, I'm, you know
where everything is.
Well,
no,
I wouldn't go that far. And I'm always pulling.
It's making me a little shaky just sitting here, frankly.
So how different are you, Steve, to Sarah's process?
My desk is immaculate usually. I mean, like there's actual space to work on it, even if I'm in the middle of a project. And yeah, no, this is one of the major differences between us. I have a rage for order. I can't work if there's a mess. I need things all in place, both like professionally and personally. So, Dr. Skwire is much more organic.
I'm Hayekian, really, about the organization of my office, which is order eventually emerges.
Yeah.
It's certainly not top down in any sort of way.
So you might be more the creative person then and let it kind of grow organically in terms of the approach to your work or something, and maybe Steve, I don't know, are you more institutionalized?
We were actually talking about this just the other day because we're both working on writing projects right now, and we're both in the early stages where you're really formulating your first thoughts about really narrowing down exactly what you're writing about and starting to outline a little bit.
Yeah.
And I was saying that his process is so much more orderly than mine is, and I think part of that is a disciplinary difference, which is that Steve, I think, and a lot of economists go back to some very set texts that they're always going to use. And this is in no way a criticism. There are just, if you're going to do sort of an Austrian approach to money and banking, right, there are things that you absolutely must use. He knows them really well. He's been using them for 30 years or more, right? Whereas for a paper like the one that I'm doing now, I'm using Shakespeare, right? But I'm also using because it's gotten me into questions of theology and Elizabethan politics. So I'm looking at the Book of Homilies, and I'm looking at Calvin's biblical commentaries, and I'm looking at literary criticism on Richard III, and I'm sort of drawing from all over the place.
Okay.
So rather than sort of knowing where I'm going to look when I set out my question, I set out my question, and then I think, where might there be some stuff on that?
So it's like a discovery process.
Yeah.
Spontaneous order.
I'm kind of from all over the place and finding things I don't expect.
Right.
Which is not to say that economists don't do that. I just think it's more endemic to particularly the kind of interdisciplinary literary work that I tend to do.
What's great about that is possibly it might lead you down a certain path where you may not have felt that you were going to go down, and you discover certain things that kind of blows your mind and think, I could use that really, or I could do something else with that later on by developing it even further. Whereas
I think one of the differences is that I tend to more often, I won't even start writing, like working on a project until like it's in my head and I have it. Right. And so I'm Mozart, right? When he says, is the opera done? And he says, it's just scribbling and bibbling, right? I mean, it's in my head. I have to write it. Now, that's not to say when I'll often sit down and start writing and realize as I'm writing, nope, it's a different thing than I thought it was, right? That discovery process happens too, where you realize, no, the thing I thought was the third part of this paper is really the thing that should be the first part. Right? I mean, we all get that. I think, again, Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like this project she's working on is much more one where she had a topic she wanted to explore and didn't quite know exactly what was going to happen with it. But in reading all this stuff, as she's, order emerges out of that into something coherent, right? And I think that's just some of that's disciplinary, but some of it is also sort of personal. I don't want to start working on something until I at least have a pretty good idea in my head of what that whole thing's going to look like. It's going to evolve and change as I write, but I can't kind of write. I can't even start in some sense until I have a pretty good idea in my head of what the argument is. And I think part of that, economists have the structure of economic theory too, aside from, particular books or particular theorists, right? You're always bound in by having to make an argument that works as far as theory goes. And so that constrains you in some ways.
Can I play devil's advocate here? Like, it sounds as if Sarah's type of work would keep the reader entertained for longer and would read a whole paper, whereas if people knew what you were going to write about, Steve, like you admitted yourself, you think, yeah, I've read that before, I'll skip the literature and I'll move on to whatever other new thing is emerging from your own thought process. Or does that happen at all? I'm sure it does, because I presented papers before and they just skip to the very end and look at the
Well, I mean, everybody reads the summary at the beginning and then the conclusions and checks to see if they're cited, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
there's a famous, I think it was Bob Lucas, the Nobel Prize winner. Somebody said to him one time, with econ papers, I read the introduction and the conclusion, and I just skip over all the math and see what's going on. And Lucas supposedly said something like, "Oh, that's funny. I do the opposite with them." Right? So what's your reader, right? And what does your reader want to do? So I don't know. I don't think it's, I think it's not. I think it's just more a difference. I think it's disciplinary, but I also think some of it is sort of our own approaches to writing. And I can't, so I was in this stage yesterday or the day before. I have this paper that I'm working on. I had a blank screen blank screen isn't true. I had about 600 words worth of, sort of thoughts. But I had to sit down and say, all right, I got to give myself some section headings in this thing. I got to think about, what the order of attack is for this argument and what do I, what material do I already have that I could write now? What do I, and in the case of that particular paper, there are some things I need to go back and reread and go forward and haven't read yet to sort of fill in parts of that paper too. So I think it's just, for me, it's like laying it all out and saying, all right, what does it look like? What do I have to do?
Right. We also have an occupational difference though, right? Since I'm not in a traditional academic job, it's great if I publish. Liberty Fund is delighted if I publish, but I'm not under any pressure to publish. So I have a lot more freedom to just sort of, go wandering blindly through the field.
Loose cannon,
Whatever.
Hans Christian Andersen approach, maybe like Little Red Riding Hood, and if you come across the big bad wolf.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean.
And so that frees me up to do the sort of quirky stuff that I really enjoy doing. I'm very fortunate that way. If I had a more traditional academic job, I suspect I would have, just by virtue of the need to produce on a more regular basis, I probably would have produced a much more sort of organized approach. And indeed, I suspect that if my approach were more like Steve's, I'd be a heck of a lot more productive, but I also think I might have less fun.
So I can see the advantages with two of them. Like Steve, you because you know your area, and even if the area is relatively new to you, you still want to find that structure, and by putting out those subheadings and having that structure or blueprint, it allows you to run with it and fill in those areas. And if you find that section 3 should be in section 1, it is difficult, and not trying to belittle it, because it is very difficult to put a piece of academic work together. And Sarah, yours is total opposite. You have your heading, you need to go down different paths, but there is structure when you look back and read it. Once you've find all it reads extremely well and really appeals to me the way it's written too, and something that's different. You're not under the pressure under any particular organization or academic discipline, so except maybe literature, and allows that creativity to explore. Allows you to explore your creative side.
Right, and so I mean, I just pulled up because you were. I think Steve and I actually probably end up, once I've sort of gotten through my chaotic, I have to read all of the things phase, which is where I currently am. I usually end up with sort of a solid paragraph at the top of the page. I just pulled the document that I'm working on right now. Solid paragraph at the top of the page, followed by an outline of the sections of the paper that are going to follow. Okay. I didn't know what they were when I started doing the reading all the things phase, but they've evolved as I've been reading. I think Steve is more likely to sort of say, if I'm going to answer this question, I'm going to need a section on X and then on Y and then on Z. Yep. Whereas I'm much more liable to say, I'm going to answer this question. Let me go see what I can find. Then it turns out that my sections are going to be X and Y and Z. Right? But we end up more or less in the same place.
And one of the ways when I teach this to students, right, when I spend a lot of time teaching first year students how to write research papers, one of the analogies I used to use, and it's ironic because I don't do it and she does, is like knitting a sweater, right? When you knit a sweater, you make it in pieces and then you pull all the pieces, sew all the pieces together, right? And so I often said to students, look, you need to think of this paper has sections to it, and they're like pieces of a larger thing that you're going to make, and the sections have to have their own integrity, right? And then part of what you do is get the transitions in there and make the connections and sew the thing all together. And the pattern you're looking at, right, is determined by what that thesis is, what that main line of argument is, right? And so that's how I still think about it. Another word here would be modular, right? I like to think about those sections as they're almost like mini papers of their own, right? That you're then having to make each of those arguments and then find the ways to create the transitions that tie them all together.
Right. And sometimes one of the nice things about that modular kind of thinking is that sometimes as you're writing, you think you have a writing problem. Like you think the paper's not working.
Yeah.
You think it's just like not coming together. And what it really is almost always, I find, is that it's not a writing problem. It's a structure problem, right? You have all the stuff that you need. You have the argument. You're just trying to make the argument in the wrong order. And if you move the section that's down at the bottom somewhere to the middle, then all of a sudden your paper snaps into focus.
And one of the other things we should mention too, right? I mean, we've been talking about writing academic papers, right? So we're thinking about that sort of, 20, 25, 30 page sort of typical academic paper. But other kinds of writing are different, right? I mean, I do a lot of, not so much now, but certainly when I was writing weekly or biweekly columns, right? That sort of 800 to 1200 word thing is a different thing. And the kind of long blog post 2,000 word thing is a different thing, right? For those, I'm much more, and it drives her nuts when I do this, right? Like I'll just open the laptop or sit down at the desk, and it's in, just boom, it's in my head. I don't even need an outline for that. That I can just 1,200 words I can do asleep, right? I can do 1,200 words. Now, whether they're 1,200 good words is different, and that's where she comes in and looks at it and goes, those are 1,200 okay words. We can make them better.
Or sometimes, no, you can't.
Sometimes you can't write that. No, you can't. There's been a couple of those too. But that's a different, right? That's a different kind of thing. Or even the long, I wrote this long piece for the libertarianism.org thing at Cato recently. That was about 2,200 words, I think, right? And that was in my head, and that just came out. I just sat down, and that comes out. I mean, you think of additional things as you're writing, but still, right? Those, I think of those as shorter pieces, not everyone else would, but those are different, right? I think it's when you're dealing with a sort of formal, traditional academic paper, I need to impose that structure on it.
And it's just from being, I agree. Sorry.
Same kind of thing with those shorter pieces. Even though, again, I'm much more liable to want at least to have a couple of almost like hooks to hang the thing on, sort of figured out before, because often what I'm writing about is, isn't it weird you never thought about the insane connection between this thing over here and this other completely apparently unrelated thing way the heck over here? I want to kind of have those two things in place before I then explain to people why my crazy brain sees connections, right? But again, like with Steve, with those shorter sort of 1,200 to 2,000 word things, that's often as much of a outline as I'll have before it. I'm just like, I got to connect A and 37 and make them go together.
One time I described my own sort of, idiosyncratic approach to economics and sort of interdisciplinary, saying I like to take 2 + 2 and make 5 out of it. Now, there was a joke in there about how Austrians can't do math, but I told that to Sarah one time, and she said, she said something like, well, I like to take Australia plus 37 and make platypus out of it, right? I mean, like,
platypus is a little too related to Australia.
Yeah, whatever, but yeah.
But yeah.
Like you mentioned about, Sarah, you mentioned about you like to have the clothes pegs. I came across a method, I forget the name of the author, but he wrote and it was a movie made out of it about Bagger Vance. Do you know that author?
Yes.
He had what's called the clothesline method. And what how he structures it is that you picture a clothesline, and it's like putting on a piece of clothing.
We just lost your sound.
Oh, have you? Can you hear me now?
You're back now.
Now you're back.
Yep. Can you hear me?
That's better. We got it. Good. All right, we're
good. The author of the book on Bagger Vance, he has a method called the clothesline method, and it's like a clothesline. You put a piece of clothing on it, and then from that, say a t-shirt, and that piece of t-shirt or paper has a bit of a structure of what's going on, and that could deal with chapter 1 or a particular theme, and then you hang other pieces off that primary piece, and it kind of goes a little bit deeper, and he moves on. And it's very good, effective. I'm sure it is a very effective method. It kind of clears things up and allows that structure even for something that's non-academic, such as a literary piece. Steve, you were on about how structured you are, and your desk is a reflection of that. And Sarah, you navigate in a very exploratory part of your mind, and also the readings that you have, and again reflected on your desk, I'm sure, as you mentioned earlier. Are your lives, how different are you? Or I know at the same time you arrive at the same point, because once it gets published, it's out there, and that's the whole aim. But is this like, do you bring a shopping list, for example, Steve, to the local supermarket? And Sarah, do you overspend by just
go with the shopping list?
No, well, I bring a shopping list.
You bring the shopping list.
Otherwise, I'd stand in the middle of the grocery store and just spin.
Wander around.
You know how you order an Uber and it's waiting at a traffic light, and you get of the car just spinning? That would be me.
So, Steve, if Sarah's lost in a supermarket, you could easily find. Well, maybe not. You mightn't find her at all.
Smoke coming out of breath. I'm a list maker, and a calendar person, and it's just for me. It's about just I need to know what's going to happen next, right? I just tell me what's going to happen, right? So I can prepare. And I mean, you could stereotype economists and efficiency and all that, right? One could.
We're one so inclined. One could do that.
Let me know when you're done. And
I'll just
go on, Sarah. You're going to do it.
That's but that's part of it, right? I mean, I got lots of things to do, and I want to make sure that I can get them all done.
Yeah. And actually, surprisingly, I'm a big list maker. I'm a big calendar person, but that's because I know that if I don't write stuff down, I'm nearly always about 10 seconds away from complete chaos and utter system meltdown. So like if I don't have lists, if I don't have the calendar going,
who knows?
I could wake up tomorrow in Hong Kong. Who knows? Right. So I keep it very organized because otherwise, the chaos that is always lurking right below the surface is going to completely overwhelm everything.
And I'm order all the way down. There's no chaos lurking below my surface.
And so I think we actually both really like those things about the other one. Like I love it that if I forget something, Steve has already planned for the fact that I might forget it.
Yeah.
And has, a backup plan in place for making that thing happen.
And somebody's got to make me more spontaneous. So.
Right. And I think. And I think that the fact, that I'm always sort of interested in something different, and you never know what it's going to be.
Nope.
I think Steve finds that sort of fascinating from a distance, right?
Yes. It's some kind of strange creature that I'm still quite sort of trying to figure out.
Right. He stays in the space station. I go out on the spacewalk and I come back and report. And it actually works really well. And it works really well, in fact.
And I'm the one who's making sure that the tether's still tied so you don't float away to Neptune or something.
Right. But it works really well for writing together, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm always bumping up against new stuff. I mean, I just did this for you the other day.
Right. Yeah, yes.
I'm always bumping into stuff that maybe I can't use or I'm not going to use right now, or that I think will turn into a good project for Steve and for me to work on together. And I kind of bring it back. And I'm like, ooh, look at this shiny object I just found.
So we should talk about that respect. I mean, the best example of that historically is roundabout a pound a week, right?
Yes.
So I don't know which one of us wants to start.
I'll tell the first half.
All right. You go.
Okay, so
is this the true?
It's all true, but it's a good two-part. It's a really good example of exactly this.
Yeah.
So there's a publisher whom I really like, London publisher, called Persephone Books.
Okay.
And they publish, this is the long version of the story. Sorry. You're Irish.
Yeah,
right? Pour a drink. I'll be done eventually. They publish mostly women's fiction written between World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
A lot of which has a strongly economic component because women are moving from in-home work to out-of-the-home work during those years. So while I was basically buying everything that they publish, I ran across a book that they published called Roundabout a Pound a Week. That one is not fiction. It's a book written by a group of Fabian socialist women in 1912, 13. And what they wanted to do was to test this proposition that they had heard often, which is that poor people are poor because they're irresponsible and they don't know how to manage their money, right? And that what you really need to end poverty is good money management skills. And so rather than theorizing, what this group of women did was go into one of the respectable working poor neighborhoods of London, families where the father is, an apprentice woodworker or a bricklayer, where the income of the household is round about a pound a week, and ask the women in the family to record how all of the money was spent. Right. So it's a treasure trove of economic and demographic detail from the period, right? You find out what people spent on coal, what they spent on funeral insurance, what they spent on rent, shoes, healthcare, like everything is tracked, and it's glorious. And I read it and I thought, this is awesome. I've no idea what to do with this. I wonder if anybody knows this is a thing, right? And so I went, hey, Steve,
first person.
This really cool thing. This looks like it's got money and stuff in it, and this is like your kind of stuff, but I don't know what to do with it.
I did. So I teach an economics of gender class, economics of gender and family class, right? And I do a lot of history in that class, so the history of the evolution of the family and so on. So I brought this into that class and had the students read it at a couple key places, and then created a whole sort of classroom exercise. I think it's called the Grimm calculus around this, where they can use the actual. I think it was her title because creative people. So where they actually are using the data from the book, and then they're given they're working in groups and a series of questions about, all right, how would you do this? What choices would you make here? What would you do if you had another kid? Right. So getting them, sort of putting them in the place of these sort of lower middle class, working class families 100 years ago, trying to figure this stuff out. And it's a real eye opener for them, in sort of realizing how tight the constraints are on people's behavior in terms of how, they just didn't have this room to maneuver. Losing a job or having a kid was a major thing that required all of these shifts in ways that not true now.
Yeah. Talk about the kinds of questions that the kids come up with.
Well, right. I mean, or they, one group said, can we eat one of the kids? Can we, we could,
how young can they go to work?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
4 years of age, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in economic terms, right, they're trying to figure out how to expand the production or consumption possibilities frontier here, right, in ways that ease the constraints. So it's a really good exercise in the book. I used the book. I'm pretty sure it's cited in my book on Hayek and the family. Because the data is just fascinating, right? What's in there, and as Sarah said, they wanted to sort of refute the hypothesis that the poor were poor because they couldn't manage money, and it turns out what they discovered is the reason poor people are poor is because they don't have a lot of money, right? I mean, who knew?
It's not bad management,
right?
And so one of the really interesting chapters in the book, and I'm sorry we're probably digressing enormously, is about funeral insurance, right? And the author, Maud Pember Reeves, says, the only place where you really see something that looks extravagant and that looks irresponsible is that these families tend to spend a lot of money on funeral insurance. But then she notes, when you are liable to lose children, multiple children, or when you could at any moment lose the breadwinner for the family, one of the signs of respect and of respectability is not having to bury your children in a pauper's grave, right? Which is, first of all, chilling to read in 2018, right? To read this written just over 100 years ago, right? But also explains why a family would choose to spend the kind of money that they do on funeral insurance rather than on shoes for the kids.
Yeah.
Or an extra bedroom, or whatever else they're trading off against funeral insurance. It's a fascinating book, and I think it's very effective for working with students because it's hard to talk to students about, say, child labor, right? Privileged college kids in the West, child labor is obviously bad on its face, right? But you give them the Grimm calculus exercise and they start saying, well, okay, I'm looking at the numbers and can my 4-year-old work? Right? Would that be well, that's a good question. You tell me.
That's people forget not people forget, I wouldn't say that, but we're so far removed now from those events, even though they are being experienced in other parts of the world, and we may complain about it, but we were there once especially during the Industrial Revolution and moving away from agriculture. And these smaller hands can actually go into the looms and clean out those looms while the looms are running. Then you had tuberculosis, you had tenements, a lot of diseases, and no medicine. I don't think paracetamol or penicillin was discovered at that time. Perhaps it was, but it might not have been rolled out in a mass way.
Yeah, penicillin's not till after World War II.
Yeah, 1950.
Oh, yes. So the mortality rates and the life expectancy was high and low respectively. So
I have a slide that I use when I have a talk I do on sort of capitalism in the family, and I have a slide that a friend of mine took at a cemetery, I think in Louisiana, and it's one giant headstone with the names of 5 or 6 kids from the same family, all of whom died. And you look at the ages, all of whom died before they were 14 or so, right? So, that was the world. And that was like mid 19th century. Yeah. Right. So that's the world.
Yeah. And have you developed anything on that, Sarah, that book? I know we talked about that website and those books in our previous episode. And again, I'll put the links on it, but after your discovery and hand it over to Steve.
Yeah, I did a column on it for Foundation for Economic Education, and the column is called, I think, Not the Poorest People in the District. Okay. So I'll send you a link to that so you can link the readers to that. I'm trying to think if I've done. Steve and I did a joint talk at the Association for Private Enterprise Education on using the Grimm calculus exercise in a classroom.
Yeah, it was a teaching session.
Yeah. I don't know if we've done anything else on that. We should. It's a little hard to know what to do with it, right? I would think it would be open to some really interesting sort of analysis of the data in there. But I wonder if you could pair it with some fiction or something in interesting ways.
Or I wonder, I know the answer to this question is yes, I just don't know what. I'm sure someone has done a similar exercise with the working poor or perhaps impoverished folks in other parts of the world, right? It would be interesting to compare people who are dealing with those kind of constraints now versus 100 plus years ago in that context.
Well, it would go well with this is how all of our writing happens. This is how all of our projects happen.
You want to know what we talk about at dinner? This is what we talk about at dinner.
It would go well with Carol Stack's All Akin, which you love, right? Which is a look at sort of community and what would you say, non-market exchange and community exchange among poor urban black families in
the late 60s. It's not Midwest. We don't know the city, but late 60s. A classic bit of ethnography. Now I want to. Do you have a copy of my book here somewhere? I get it. You don't.
Yes.
You do. Okay. Because now I got to look and see whether I did that somewhere in the book.
Unless I gave it to somebody.
Whether I tied Stack and that together. I might have. I mean, both of those are texts that I teach from in that kind of gender class. So certainly, I probably have an exam question somewhere that ties them together.
I think that you do.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
But
this book has barely been touched, Dr. Skwire. The binding is creaky.
That's because I read it in TypeScript.
Okay.
And fixed it. That's why you want us on together.
Yeah, that's it. I want to see these natural slip-ups maybe and little arguments that might, or little digs that might be going on with one another.
I figured you were just sitting over there being consumed with regret about having the two most talkative people.
No, I'm enjoying this. This is like watching TV but being interactive. the new television. As I said, the Sarah and Steve show. And the lighting has dipped a little, Sarah. When you got up, you came back and then it brightened up again and then it dipped. So I thought there might have been your emitting light.
I do my best.
It's possible. Anything's possible, really.
There was another question I had there. It was about that book. Oh, yeah, you were saying about the Grimm calculus. Like, there's journals out there, like the Journal for Economic Teaching, and they love that type of stuff. Yeah. That if you could share with us how you actually deal with the Grimm calculus and how you introduce it into lectures and what you get students to do, that'd be a great paper to read.
We should just write that up.
Yeah, we should. As we were having that conversation a couple minutes ago, I was thinking to myself, why haven't we written that up for a pedagogy journal? Because that would be a good thing to do. Yes, it would.
So when you're writing, then no matter what you're writing, do you always get bogged down on the first paragraph or the first sentence, or do you just try to let the flow happen and then edit? And how many re-edits do you do? Or is that is this something that no, you're not superhuman and you just do it once off? Unless it's a blog.
Nobody here is superhuman, I'll tell you that. I think it varies from project to project for me. First of all, I'll say that the best rule of writing ever, for me at least, is I like to have some kind of introduction in place when I start writing. I can't just sort of start in the middle of it. I know people who can start in the middle of the paper and then kind of put a section before it and a section after it and sort of build out that way. Weirdly, I'm too linear for that. There's apparently something that I am too linear to do. Okay. So I like to have an introduction in place. That introduction that is in place when I start writing is 99.99% of the time bears no resemblance to the actual introduction for the paper. Okay. Because I will often write the introduction for the paper that I think I am starting to write. Yep. And then as I write it, Hayek happens, right? Things evolve, things change. The order of my sections, as I was saying, will often shift and change. And so the last thing I do when I'm writing a paper is write the real introduction.
Okay. One way to think about that, I think, is that first introduction. I'm the same way with introductions. The first introduction is not for your reader; it's for you, right? You're writing it for you. To me, it's about how I get my own thoughts out.
Yeah.
And sort of organize it. It's my organizing. It's my clothesline to hang everything on, right? But the paper might end up going in different ways. And so I need to go back at the end and make sure I write the introduction that my reader needs, not the one I need.
Are there any hidden tricks that you have discovered yourself along the way that might get you to get started or structure yourselves through writing a paper? I know I don't want to use the word structure, but is there something that you discovered yourself that works, like, I don't know, early morning, late cups of coffee first? Do you have to do some tasks, or is this writing has to be done first thing when first part of your day? Are you more creative? Are you more settled when you get to going and then you deal with the dishes and the shopping in the supermarket?
So Dr. Johnson said that nothing concentrates a man's mind so wonderfully as the knowledge that he is to be hanged in the morning. By which I mean to say, I like a deadline.
Well, you just put a whole new spin on referee number 2 also.
Right. But I like a deadline, right? So, and
I never thought of a deadline like that. No, yeah.
Yeah, but it really is. I mean, that's your, it's a deadline. Yeah. That's, you're dead if you don't get it in by then. Yeah. So people will often say to me, hey, I was wondering if you would write me a thing on, something literary and economic, just send it to me whenever. Okay. And what I say to them is, if you want it whenever, you are never going to get it. Yeah. Because it's going to keep going to the bottom of the pile on my desk, right? Mm-hmm. If you actually want something from me, if you really want me to write something, say, hey, Sarah, can I have 2,000 words on this by such and such a date? And I will say yes, and I'll put it in my calendar, and you will have a thing. But for me, the best sort of organizing feature that I can have is a looming deadline, because I just have too much ego to be late. It really troubles me to be late with something. Like even when I was, expecting and getting ready to have children, any day I'd be writing to people and saying, I'm really, really sorry, but I think I'm going to be going into labor anytime now. And I might be late with that thing that I promised you. And I know that when Steve got ill, we were both sending email to people and going, I'm really sorry. I planned to do it, but I swear.
I got cancer, really.
I mean it. We have this other thing, but we're never late and we never cancel it. Oh my God.
Yeah. And so a couple of things. This is when students ask me this, and I've done some workshops for my friends at Mercatus with grad students about this, where we talk about, how do you create an environment in which you can write effectively? And my dear friend Emily Shamley Wright has a whole sort of, set of really good answers that work for her. And, and so she says, oh, that's a great system you have there. And then she turns to me and goes, well, and I say, I got no system. But a couple things. I think one serious piece of advice is, faced with a blank screen, just write. Just start writing. Even if you think it's nonsense, just start writing. It's amazing when you do that, how order emerges from it. I sat down the other day with this current paper, just intending to jot a couple of section headings down. And I thought, I really should probably maybe just write a couple sentences of that introduction, right? The introduction for me. And I look up, it's half an hour later, and I've written the whole introduction, and, it's a page and a half worth of introduction, right? And I think it's just, you gotta convince yourself that it's okay to just get started and do it.
Yeah. There are ways to trick yourself into that, right? Because, so I will, in general, unless I'm working on something enormous, I will, for most academic papers, will take notes, on the computer for it. I used to I'm old enough that I used to do this on 3x5 cards, but I've reluctantly joined, the 21st century.
The 20th century.
I use 3x5 cards.
Streaming into the 19th century.
I'm still working on her, dragging her out of the 16th century.
But anyway, so I'll take notes in a Word document and just sort of keep a running set of that, so that even when I am first setting out to write, I don't have a blank page. I've got a document full of notes.
Yeah, that's
right. And if you want to get cute, you can sort of rearrange your quotes into the order you think you might use them, or you can just use this as kind of a running bank of stuff to work off of. And I think it feels less daunting when you can say, oh, I've got, 6 pages of quotations I'm planning to use in some way or another in this paper. And then it's not so scary thinking about, and I got to come up with, 40,000 words.
Right.
It's a piece of cake when you've already got 10.
And that's really important. Like, this paper I'm working on right now has kind of been on my to-do list for a number of months. And I had to turn in a sort of outline abstract of it earlier on, but I knew the deadline was August 31st, so I'm turning to it now. And I think when you've got that situation, having an outline or an abstract or just I had 650 words worth of notes and ideas that when I would think of something, I'd open that file, jot it down, knowing I'm not going to write this paper for another month or two or whatever, but throwing that into the file. And then when you sit down, right, to actually start writing, you've actually got these things there that you can work with. But what I was going to say before, though, see, like, the thing for me, some people say, well, I need 3 hours where I sit down and I turn off my, internet and I have to focus see, and I'm strange in that I don't need that. In fact, it's often not helpful to me. I actually like being able to, I have the ability to write, get distracted, and then go back to where I was and kind of pick it up right from where I was, right? I have, what do I call it? Adult onset, internet driven attention deficit disorder, right? So
Dr. Johnson diagnosed you with that, did he?
Yeah, right. I'm the guy who can write a page and then go do Facebook for 5 minutes, right? Or look at the sports section of the paper, right? And then come back and pick up where I left off. Or when I was department chair, I hated closing my door because, I wanted students to feel welcome and so on. And my colleagues sometimes couldn't believe how I could work on professional writing with my door open and people interrupting me every so often. And I just, for whatever reason, I have the ability, those interruptions don't normally throw me off too much. But I think one of the things, and we've talked about this before, one of the things I need to be better at is, we've all had this where you're writing, you get interrupted, and you come back to it, and you were in the middle of a sentence, and you have no damn idea where now the sentence was going to go. So I try, when people come in, I say, let me finish this sentence or this thought or whatever it is, right? Because, or leave myself at least 2 words of notes about where it's going to go. Yeah. Otherwise, you come back and go, what? Where was this going, right? And that's really frustrating.
And I extend that actually so that if I'm working on a, not like a blog post or a column, if I'm working on a longer paper, when I'm done writing for the day, the last thing that I do is write the first 2 sentences of the next part of the thing that I'm writing. Okay. So that, first of all, I remember where I was, right? Because as we all, crash rapidly into late middle age, it gets harder and harder to remember where you were, but also because it gives me that sense of momentum, right?
Right.
I'm coming back to it, and I know I'm coming back to it because I already started the next bit.
Right.
Okay.
And I'll do that. My version of that is to sometimes leave myself a little like note that basically says, now, literally will say, next you need to, then you need to.
Yeah.
And sometimes what I'll do is where I left off, I'll just quickly highlight it in red or turn the font red or something. So I know that's where I was.
I do the same thing. I'll also, sometimes if I'm writing along and things are going really well and I hit a pothole where I know a thing has to go, but I don't want to sort of get up and find the thing or get up and, I don't want to wait to get that book from the library or wait to get back to my home office instead of my office at Liberty Fund or for whatever reason. Early drafts of my stuff are often filled with highlighted sentences that say stuff like, put that thing from Macbeth here.
Okay.
Or Adam Smith says something, find it.
Yeah. So instead of looking for it now and having that interruption, do it another time.
Right.
Yeah, great idea. Great tip.
High quote goes here.
Right, because I know that the thing that I want is out there, but I know that if I go look for it, I'm going to lose 2 hours of time. And if you're already in the writing groove, right? And if you know what that thing is that's going to go there well enough that you can, keep going without having it precisely right, then you do have to go back, put it in, and also make sure that what you said about it remains true once you look at what Smith or Hayek actually said. And I think and that can be a flaw, not of yours, but a flaw that we see when people are working on stuff they know really, really well.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're so familiar with it that they actually write about what they think they know it says rather than what it actually says.
And another quick thought here, right? I mean, I think if as a writer you find yourself getting into flow, right? Where you are just, and you don't let yourself get interrupted. Ride that out until you're just out of gas. And so again, another weird thing with me is I need music to write.
I was just going to ask.
I cannot write can you see the face? Right. I can't write without music. It's like what it does. It's like what some people need white noise, right? And for me, the music has it. But what she's going to tell you in a second is if it has lyrics, the lyrics get in my head and they interfere with whatever Right. See, and I don't have that. In fact, I know when I've been in flow writing is I will kind of stop for a second and go, I have no idea what the last 4 songs were that we're playing, right? Because, didn't I just start this CD? It's over already? Right? Because the music has just completely kind of receded into the background and it lays this sort of foundation from which I then can do other things. If it's quiet, weirdly, I hear everything, right? And I find that to be more distracting than having the music on. And right, I wrote, almost, all 3 of my books, I think in the acknowledgments, at least 2 of them, I thank some particular CD or some particular, right? Because that was the one where a lot of the book was written listening to that, right? So I find, beats per minute matter for how I write. There's weird, right? Yeah. Certain kinds of music can be writing better.
So you mentioned Mozart earlier on and Rush in the previous episode. So would they be one of the 2 or the 2 top ones that you might listen to?
I will just, so in the old days, right? In the old days, I would have particular CDs. So the last book was written, a lot of it was written to a Buddy Rich tribute CD about big band jazz music. Okay. I believe in the macro book, I thanked Stop Making Sense. Talking Heads Stop Making Sense, which I used a lot. That's something about the rhythm of that CD and their rhythm section work. So, but now I tend to just leave my iTunes on shuffle and whatever comes up. I don't think about are there particular kinds of music I will write to better or worse, whatever. I just need to have the music going as a way to sort of make me feel comfortable.
Headphones, white noise machine, pot of tea. Yeah.
Wait, no. What I'll do is I'll edit out of tea.
So I haven't tried that.
Smoking pot.
I hear good things.
Yeah. The other thing for me, I've discovered over the years, I tend to write better after lunch. I don't know why. I think it's like in the morning I need to do my usual kind of stuff in the morning that kind of clears out things, right? And maybe it's years of being an administrator where I felt like in the morning I had to do all the administrative stuff But even when I was on sabbatical, I found that I just write, whatever my energy level or my focus is tends to be better after lunch. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, no, same here. The organizational stuff. I need a little while to sort of complain about the fact that I actually have to write rather than just everyone being able to recognize my brilliance.
I need 2 hours
to understand what I would have said had I bothered to write it down, and they should just all know this. Right?
I need 2 hours to procrastinate.
Yeah. But if you know that about yourself, right, you write that into your time, right? So what do I do in the morning? Well, maybe I'll take some notes. Maybe I'll, possibly clean my desk. Possibly not. Maybe I'll answer a bunch of email, whatever, kind of clear the decks.
You forgot, go shopping at Amazon.
Wait a little while, and then sort of, all right, I'll get down to it. And
some people write, like, again, my friend Emily writes early in the morning, right? And I'm like, nope.
Well, Hans Eichholz, who's a colleague of mine here at Liberty Fund, did his entire book on Thomas Jefferson between the hours of, I think, 5 and 8 in the morning, because he had little kids at home. So he'd get up, write for 3 hours and, get them to school, go into Liberty Fund, right? Which is how Trollope did it, right? So
it's like who?
Here we go.
Right, this is what happens.
By the way, when Hans hears this and you just compared him to Trollope,
he's going to be very proud. So Anthony Trollope, the great sort of great Victorian novelist, who anybody who likes politics or economics should read and will enjoy Trollope, wrote an autobiography that almost killed his literary career because he revealed his writing process. Okay. And I did a piece about this for it was either for Foundation of Economic Education or it was for
Liberty Fund.
Fraser. I'll find it. I'll send you the link. So he wrote about his writing process, and he said, "Here's what I do. I get up every morning at like 4:30. I write 10,000 words, and then I go to my job at the post office. And the next day, I get up, I do the same thing." And the next day I get up and I do the same thing. And if I finish a novel at 6,500 words, I start the next novel and write until I've written right. So he wrote the same number of words every single day.
But not 10,000 a day. He'd aim for 10,000.
Yeah. I don't remember what his it's in the but and it's incredible. And people read this and they were horrified. They're like, where is the artistic suffering?
Yes.
Where is the waiting for the muse to descend and fill you with
romantics?
Right. No, I'm not going to do that. But and they were just sort of horrified that his process was so businesslike and mechanical. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of people, it took sort of the magic out of the novels and out of the world that he creates. Whereas for me,
that's the reality of it, isn't it?
As somebody who writes, I'm like, dude, right? You are a rock star. You are my model, right? And when I was writing my dissertation, my dad used to send me inspirational Anthony Trollope quotes about writing.
Of course he did.
Which excludes like everything you ever needed to know about me right there.
Yeah.
Send me it's 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm getting email that says it's 8 o'clock. Do you know how many words Trollope would have written by now?
Dad was a lit professor, right? And my dad was a business school retired business school professor, right? Accounting and finance. So my dad's like, are you done yet? You need to get a job. Are you done? Is it done?
Well, this was, Dad sending Trollope quotes.
Yeah, was his
the English
version.
Professor way of saying, are you done yet? Are you working? Time is money, kid.
Wow.
But yeah, so, I admired that kind of process. But really, I think it doesn't matter much what your process is or what your routine is if you can get into some kind of routine, even if the routine looks to everyone else as insane as my, piles of books and
with a teapot in the
middle. And a teapot and,
and I think that's right. I tell grad students this all the time, which is it's more important to have a system than what the system is in particular. So like with time management stuff, it turns out, I reinvented on my own getting things done, or whatever the guy's big system is, right? I basically figured that out by myself for the most part. And so when I talk about this, right, I say, well, I didn't actually read the book, but it turns out I do a lot of the things that he recommends in there, but that works for me, right? I figured out what works for me. So figure out something that works, that works for you.
I just remember the name of that author, Stephen Pressfield, The Legend of Bagger Vance, and that's what I heard as well. And he gave examples like one you've just given me there, where you just get up and you do it. So if you're a morning person, you just write for your few hours, and it's like anything else, like exercise. You just have to get into the habit, and if you stop and lose the habit, you'll end up not being able to. And I think Stephen King does it too. He just gets up and writes his novels day in, day out, and he just doesn't wait for the muse and the inspiration. Just get on with it.
Right, and and there's an important point that I want to draw out too, which is, a lot of especially young scholars think that social media, they want to stay away from social media because it sucks their time and all these sorts of things. And it does, and I get that. But what I often say in response is, you can use social media, not so much Twitter, but certainly Facebook or blogging, right, as writing, right? I mean, if you follow me on Facebook, sometimes that I will test out arguments there, right? And sometimes they're long, they're a couple hundred words, right? But that's writing, that counts, right? That counts. And so as long as you're still sort of, I've been, I've had a couple of hospital stays in the last year and sort of times when my energy levels weren't there, but I never sort of walked away from Facebook or from that kind of stuff, because at the very least it keeps that juices going. You're still writing, you're still thinking, you still have to organize your thoughts. And then when you get back to academic writing after, my case for a couple months or whatever, get back to it, right? It doesn't feel so strange. You've still been exercising those muscles, right, in a different kind of way.
Yeah. And I actually want to take that in a little bit of a different direction. But while we're on the topic of social media and writing for it, I'm not in the classroom anymore. I used to teach a lot of writing. And my father and I have a writing textbook out that's in its 12th edition. Again, we'll send you a link, available for weddings, bat mitzvahs, whatever.
But in your family, that's not out of the question.
No, I know.
That's the wedding gift, is it?
Exactly. It's a perfect wedding gift. But if I were going to design a writing course now for, advanced writing students, or if I was going to do a writing course for maybe incoming graduate students, I think that the course I would design would start off with, write an academic article. And then all of the following assignments would require them to shrink that article down for different forms of social media, right? Mm-hmm. So I'd have them write the article. Then I would have them write the, sort of long form magazine article version of their academic piece. Then I'd have them write the blog post of their academic piece. Then I'd have them write the Facebook post of their academic piece. And then I'd have them write the tweet.
Yep.
Right. So because I think distill is part of it. What are you really writing about? What are you really writing about? What are you really writing about is part of it. I know these hand gestures are going to be super helpful for your podcast.
It's like you're measuring Steve's head.
College, right? Eastern European over here. I can't talk if I'm sitting on my hands. But also because I think, given the prevalence of social media, given the importance of social media, and given, at this exact moment, how incendiary what we say on social media can be, we need to be very thoughtful about how we're presenting our academic work and how we're presenting our research out there. The cutest and snappiest way to tweet our paper on, how the working poor spend their money, might not be the best way to convey it if we don't want to get in trouble.
Yep.
Right. And so I think it's a real skill to think about each of those ways of presenting the same kind of research as a different genre of writing. I also think that, no, I can't remember because you interrupted me.
Well, while you think about that.
Damn it. What else do I think?
You should have written it down.
It's a different, I mean, what's great about that too is that the rhetoric is different for each one, right? It's a different genre, right? Different kind of persuasion. So years ago, okay, don't.
No, go ahead. I'll write it down.
So years ago, and I think they still to some extent. Yeah, my friends at Mercatus, and when I was a grad student, we sort of got to thinking about it this way. Whenever you did an academic piece, you should think about what's the policy piece you could write based on that, and then what's the op-ed piece you could
That's
write.
What I was just going to say, right? You gotta sort of multi-purpose your material when you can.
Right. And it's you get multiple publications out of it. But again, it's that same exercise in taking the same material and thinking, now I got a different audience. I have to write at a different level. I've got to condense the ideas down this way. I mean, I think one of the things when I was an administrator, one of the real challenges for me was writing, like grant proposals where I had a very strict word limit. Right. And you learn and writing those weekly columns, especially for fee when I was at about, it varied from time to time, but 800, 900 words, right? Learning to write within that's a different kind of deadline, right? It's a writing to write within that constraint was extremely helpful in sort of learning to write concisely, and getting arguments across in the most sort of efficient ways possible, right? And I think that, Lord knows academics could cut down their word counts in most cases, right? So I think the experience, and I would say to grad students in any discipline, right? These kind of things we're just talking about now are really important exercises in getting your ideas across in the least number of words possible, or imagining, we talk about the elevator speech for a job. I used to say to my undergraduates, how would you explain this concept to your parents over dinner? Yeah. Right? Yeah. So thinking about, and in the end, see, now I'm going now. In the end, what this all comes down to is learning how to teach what you know, right? What you're doing in all these different exercises that we're talking about is you're teaching to different audiences. So therefore you have to think in terms of how do I teach this thing in the way that's relevant to this particular audience.
Right. So one of the best pieces of writing advice I got was a 2-word question that my dissertation director used to ask me, which was, so what?
Yes.
You write, you bring in a 40-page chapter, you'd read it and go, so what?
Right. I wish I had that stamp as a referee, right? Just so what?
Why the hell should I care? Yeah. Right. And I think that's very important. With all of this kind of work, it's very easy to think that just because I think it's like super exciting that like this is here and this is over here, like people should be excited because I'm excited. Right. It would be nifty if the world worked that way, because then, I'd be making $2 million. But my job is to explain to people why they should care. Right. And that so what is going to be different in an academic context than it's going to be in a op-ed context, or than it's going to be on Facebook, or than it's going to be in any of these other kind of venues for talking about ideas that we may have. Right. So while, I may talk about the same Shakespeare sonnet in an academic paper as I would in a column for Foundation for Economic Education, or as I might in a lecture for Institute for Humane Studies, or as I might in a sort of a public talk at Students for Liberty conference, or the like, the way that I will use that tool, right, or that piece of material. And I tease economists that poems are my data sets, right? Yeah. So the way that I'll use that particular data set and the things I will tell people they should care about and the reasons I will give them for caring about it will be different in every context, right? And I think that's a skill you have to learn and a skill you have to practice. And you also have to be, willing to let go of, but the really important thing about it is like, this is the one time that the semicolon appears in the, right. I mean, you have to be willing to let go of sometimes the bit that most interests your academic side, right? And remember the stuff that other people care about.
Yep.
When it comes to refereeing a piece of work, and say your piece of work has been refereed, and you put it out there, you put all your work and effort into it, and it comes back saying something like resubmit or revise and resubmit, and it's rejected. How, right, so, like, do you think your finalized piece of work is the final edit and it should automatically be submitted? Or do you...
I mean, obviously.
There's
right.
But how do you deal with...
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, but you don't know who's refereeing your piece of work, so you can't
it's
get in
like
touch
the
with them.
7 stages of grief or whatever, right? I mean, so, it's always the same with me. I get the referee's report back and I start cursing, right?
Idiot.
You idiot.
Moron.
You don't know what you're talking about, right? Oh, really? You're complaining about that, right?
You're just mad because I didn't cite you.
Yeah, right. And in fairness, you read the referee's report, sometimes you go, okay, that's, maybe one good point in there. But it's always, your ego takes a hit and your defensiveness comes up. And so I think this is advice for young scholars. In the old days, we used to say, put it in a drawer. Right now, I just say, close the file, close the referee report, put it over there, store it somewhere, come back to it in a week. Nothing's going to happen in a week that matters. Come back to it in a week, okay? And when you look at it in a week, what you're going to think is, the other reaction I tend to have is, there's so much work to fix this paper. And then you come back in a week and you look at it again and 2 things happen. You go, all right, they're not that unreasonable. This is actually going to make the paper better. And you realize, and it's not as much work as I thought it was going to be. Almost, 80% of the time, both of those are true.
But even referees can come back with conflicting views.
Yes, which is the other thing. You realize that you don't have to take every suggestion made for the revision of the paper, right? I think that if it's a large suggestion that you decide not to take up, you got to talk to the editor about it. You have to say, look, this is what they're asking. It happens with my stuff sometimes. People are like, well, what we really need here is an incredibly long discussion about some economic issue about which Sarah knows nothing, right? And I've written to editors and said, look, that's beyond the scope of what I can do. If you want that, this has to be a co-authored piece because I am reminding you that I am not an economist and I cannot give you that. I will add a note sometimes saying, there's trying to point to some work that's been done on the economic issue that I can't cover fully and admitting that I can't cover it fully and that it's beyond the scope of the paper. And usually that is enough to get over that. But you can, it's a conversation. Revisions are a conversation between you and the editors. And you can say, look, I took up X and Y and Z, but I had to let A, B, and C go because, I think this is incorrect or I'm not capable of giving you that. Or if I were to give you that, I need another 6 months on the paper.
And some journals and some editors will ask you to write that cover letter, right? That gives you that the space to make that argument about why you did this and why you didn't do that. And I've asked students to do the equivalent of that too in the revision process to say, I want a cover letter with your next draft that explains to me what you did and why you changed this. And I think. And
you can sometimes write that into your introduction.
Yep.
Right. So if you started working as I have kind of in this weird little, interdisciplinary niche. Right. So either I will at the outset say, I know I'm going to need a co-author on this one. Or when I'm writing the introduction, I will say, this is explicitly the kind of work that I am doing. Here is explicitly the kind of work that I am not doing. I did a paper on the intellectual history project on Margaret Fell Fox, who's a 17th century Quaker, and the way that she talked about rights and where they came from. And I knew as I was writing the paper that a bunch of philosophers were going to be reading it. And I said, I can feel the arguments about rights theory and natural rights and natural law lurking out there. And I don't want to, that's like several cans of worms that I don't want to open. So it just says in my introduction, this is not a paper about rights theory. This is a paper about how one particular 17th century thinker wrote about rights and where they came from. And just very clearly bracketing off, I am not doing this. That's your job. Here is what I'm doing. And that is my job. And that was very helpful.
You might want to tell the story of the first paper we wrote together.
I think I did that on the last one.
Okay. All right. Then we won't do that again. Mm-hmm. So one other thing to say here too, I think this is a thing with referees. I mean, referees should never be refereeing papers in ways that where the referee's report is, here's the paper I think you should have written.
Mm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's not really your job as a referee. Your job as a referee is to say, like the old Ladies' Home Journal, can this marriage be saved? Right here, can this paper, is there something here that's valuable? And if there is, if you don't think this draft gets it, but if you think there's something here that's valuable, a good referee gets inside the paper and says, here's how to make this paper into something better, right? I get what you're trying to do here. It doesn't really work. Here's how you could make it do what I think you're trying to do. But if the referee's report is no, you should write this paper over here, which is the paper I think, that's just not helpful. And it's really not what referees should be doing. I always want to say to those referees, then you go write it. Because I ain't writing it, right?
I refereed a paper there recently for the Journal of Cultural Economics, I think. And I was a third referee. And I was, I have to, look, I accepted it. They gave me something like a 48-day deadline. And I think it was on the 44th, I decided to get cracking on it. And it made me more productive and read it in depth. And I was like, look at this. This is interesting. And coincidentally, it happened after my interview with you, Sarah. Have you lost me?
No, we're back now.
Oh yeah. Coincidentally, I got these, I was asked to referee it after my interview with you, Sarah. And I noticed after I read it and I gave my feedback and that, I noticed that what Steve was saying, some of the other referees were kind of bringing them down a different avenue. And you also referred to it as well when it came to philosophy or the philosophers. And some of them suggested maybe you should bring in some behavioral economics into it, and maybe you should relate it to what was going on in this century or this decade. And I was able to see through that and suggested, well, you don't have to take those viewpoints. Why not try to ring fence and say, we're staying back in the period of Adam Smith and Jane Austen. And we want to make the comparisons of that type of period. And you don't have to bring it into this particular century, not even this decade. And I don't know what the feedback, how they took that feedback, but I thought it would be not a better paper, but I thought it'd be going back to the initial idea of the paper rather than trying to write 2 or 3 papers. And I think if that was the case, the author probably would have just left it in a drawer and be done with it.
Right. And so I think of that, right? This takes us right back to the beginning, as all good conclusions should, right? I think that this is where that rewriting your introduction when your paper is done becomes so important, because you can then use your introduction not only to say what you're going to do and why you're going to do it, but also to do a little bit of sort of defensive rhetorical judo.
Yes.
Where you say, some of you may object that, it is conceivable that some may wonder why.
A reader might think.
Yes.
And that's why I suggested doing the introduction. Just say this is of the period in the 18th century.
Right. That just says, we're going to focus explicitly on this, or I am bracketing off the discussion. I realize that my topic touches on issues of, the history of centralized banking or some other thing that Sarah doesn't know anything about. I leave that discussion to my colleagues in economics. Yeah. What I am focusing on instead is on what people thought banks did when they wrote poems about banks, or, or whatever craziness I'm focusing on.
And I think junior faculty and young scholars are just so pressured to get things accepted, right? That they think they have to go through the checklist and do everything the referees say, and that they have no agency sort of in pushing back and saying, no, my paper's not about that, right? And so I think it's good to encourage younger scholars to exercise that agency. It's okay to say to the editor, look, I've got conflicting reports here. Here's how I want to go. Or he's asking too much, or she's asking too much of me that I want to, this is not what the paper's about. It's okay. And one of the reasons it's okay to do that is at the end of the day, there's so many journals now, right? That you'll find another home for it. As my mentors at George Mason used to say, you should have no unpublished papers. right? So there's always a home for everything, right? And it's okay. I mean, you have to step down a little bit in journal quality to avoid wasting your time with this referee who doesn't get what you're trying to do. Then okay.
Yeah. Okay. On the other hand, let it be read into the record that sometimes referees know exactly what they're talking about and manage to put their finger right smack in the middle of the problem that you knew was there in your paper, but you either hadn't figured out quite what the problem was, or you were praying like hell that no one would notice.
And which is why, young scholars, one of the smart things for young scholars to do when they get a paper back with referees reports that we're talking about is to go to one of their colleagues, a more senior colleague, and say, hey, look at what these referees said. Is this reasonable, right? Is this, and don't be afraid to seek out that advice. You're not in this by yourself to figure out all these nuances. Your colleagues are there to help. Most of your colleagues.
Yeah. And I think that's important because which is another way Facebook is useful too, right? Writing and researching can feel really, really lonely and really, really isolating. Some of us enjoy being lonely and isolated, but for the crazy extroverts, right, that can be hard, right? And having people to bounce stuff off of, right? Mm-hmm. And I will, because I tend to write things that are a little, outside the normal boundaries of polite discussion or whatever. I will run stuff by people and go, hey, does this sound like, is this at least interesting? Yep. Right? Does this sound like a thing that, like, does it sound remotely plausible that
it's like market research.
I've described my Facebook, page as a 5,000 person seminar, but in a bar with, music and sports and all this other stuff going on, right, and really good food.
And bar fights.
And occasional bar fight, but they're there. I mean, when you use it seriously, you can throw ideas out there in a very low risk environment and see if it sticks. And if it turns out you said something idiotic and you want to delete it, you can delete it. Mm. But you learn something, right, that might be really helpful for whatever professional project you're working on.
That's true, yeah. Like, it just reminds me of what you were saying earlier on about write something. Like a previous guest I had, Morton Jervin, he said always write something that has eventual home for it in terms of, he writes to perhaps be able to make money from it, for example, to write his book. So if he was to write on issues in Africa, he has a book in mind. As you mentioned, the two of you mentioned, if you were to write a course, Sarah, you would break it down into a blog post and all of these different types of content. And another an example of a guest I had who was able to write, he didn't have to be at his desk or find time, but he wrote his book, Manu Sadia, he wrote his Trekonomics book on his iPhone. So when he was walking around, he had ideas, he'd type it all into his notepad, and he developed his thought process from that, and his book came from it then. As a result of that. So these are all little hacks. So I
have to tell you a story now, right?
You do the same then, do you? Or something similar.
I know. So
I'm telling you, we should be at a bar right now.
Right.
Okay.
So, next time.
Well, it's a good time for me in Ireland, so I have a cans of Coors in the fridge.
I can't do anything like that on my phone. I had a sort of complex Facebook message I had to write, and I'm looking at I can't do this on the phone. I have to do this in front of an actual computer, right? And one of the things early on in our relationship, I can remember what the particular details, but she started writing something on her iPhone, like some long, complicated, I know what it was.
Oh, it was a complicated email of advice to a young scholar.
Right. And she's like doing it on her iPhone. I'm like, no, how? I can't, right? How do you, I can't.
I've written entire columns on my iPhone, sent them to the editor, gotten them back, edited them.
On the iPhone.
Sent them back. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, why not? It's a computer in your hand, isn't it, at the end of the day?
And I travel a lot.
It's in your hand. It's too small. I need space.
I travel a lot, right? So, especially if it's something that needs a quick turnaround, or if I happen to get an idea for a column while I'm on an airplane, and airplanes are fabulous places to write. They're vastly underestimated
and great paper
as writing spaces. Because mostly there's like enough people around you that you don't feel lonely. Nobody particularly bothers you, and someone will bring you tea whenever you ask. It's lovely.
And you almost have that white noise as well with the engine going on.
Yeah, I know, right. I know.
So, I want to be able to do a whole column on an iPad or in my case on an iPhone, right? Because
here's why I can't write on my phone. And it goes back to an earlier thing we were talking about. I can't write on my phone because I can't work in an environment where the technology and the software is such that I don't feel completely comfortable with it, and where it's not, I need to have it organized in ways that maximize my efficiency. So for example, my version of Word, right, is extremely customized. I've got the little toolbar. I'm looking at hers on her screen right now. There's like nothing. It's like the generic Word. Mine's completely customized to have all kinds of shortcuts and stuff on there.
You could customize. I had no idea.
I hope you heard what she just said.
Hang on, no, is this your toolbar on Word? Is it?
Yeah.
I didn't know it could be customized.
The ribbon and the toolbar, right? I have them completely customized, right? In fact,
I'm with you on that, Sarah.
I just bought a new computer and I had to remember how to export it so you can just import it right to the new computer. Yeah. Anyway, so it's completely customized so that I have all these shortcuts that I don't need to go into the menus and find things. Boom, boom, boom. And on a phone, I just can't, I don't feel that level of comfort on the phone, right? It's like when I sit down to write, and my version of Excel is customized, not as deeply as my Word, right? But it's the same. When I want to use those programs, I have to feel like they're seamless with me. It's like driving a car that you've been driving for years and you know exactly how it's going to behave. And I just can never get that level of comfort on the phone. Even with the Word app installed, it's just not the same. I can't do it.
I mean, I certainly couldn't do serious academic writing on the phone. Yeah. Like if you got to put in footnotes, right? You can't do that on the iPhone.
I can't even write a column.
Yeah. Somebody needs to come up with better footnoting software, and now you're going to get email from all of your listeners recommending footnoting software to me, and I apologize for that.
Do you do that? Do you use any other software like Evernote or Scrivener? Scrivener, nothing like that. No, just a simple Word document.
I think this is generational. I honestly think this is generational. I don't, and I do so much by memory. It's actually, when I write, okay. I have a near photographic memory for books and for quotes and things, right? And so I can tell you like that Hayek quote is on the upper left-hand part of a page somewhere, right? So I almost have no notes. I don't keep like I never did 3x5 cards. I never did stuff like, right? I never had stuff like that. I just, right. See, and if I need it, I know where it is. I mean, when I was younger, I probably did more of that, but certainly now, right? I know where it is. If I need it, I can find it. Sometimes I'll jot myself a note. And if you open my books, sometimes in that sort of the frontispiece of the book and that blank white page, there'll be a few little handwritten notes. It'll say page 78 and then a little short reminder of what's on page 78. But that's about it. And I it's only even me I didn't really keep a calendar until, within the last decade anyway, when when things were busy enough, right? But other than that, I did a lot of stuff on memory.
Sarah, 3x5 method, another author, Ryan Holiday, uses it, and he uses that to write his books. I don't know if you've ever heard of Ryan Holiday. He wrote Ego is the Enemy and The Obstacle is the Way, and a couple of the Stoic books as well. So that's his method, and it seems very effective, and it's able to move it about by hand and
sections and that kind of thing. Yeah. I'm waving my arms around again, listeners. Yeah. You can sort of adjust things to where you want them to go, which is nice, or refile them into different orders. It also makes it easy to recycle if you don't want to recycle or reuse quotes from project to project if you're reusing some of the same material. Right. But what I do so if you really want to get in the nitty gritty of how my note taking process, such as it is, works, since I'm in the middle of that right now. I start by sort of reading all the things until I have a pretty good handle on what I think it is that I want to say. While I'm reading, I'm underlining or sticking Post-it notes in and that kind of thing. Once I have read through my stuff, I'll then pick them back up and start transcribing the notes. What I'll do is when I start transcribing from any work, I've got Doubtful and Dangerous is what I'm reading right now about Elizabethan England and political succession, right? So I will type out the entire bibliographical entry that will eventually go in the bibliography of the paper. Type that out. Underneath that, I will put the notes that I take from that book, each with the page number at the end, so that when I'm writing the paper, basically my footnotes are done.
Cool.
right? I cut and paste or copy paste the quote from the document where I'm transcribing all the notes into the body of the paper, grab the bibliographical information and the page number for the footnote.
So you know where everything's going to be if you have to go look back on it.
Yes.
And then the bibliography is the worst thing to do, really, at the end of your paper when you have it all done and you haven't got your bibliography all straightened out yet. Right. Having to go back to all of that is the worst.
Right. And so then it's not so bad because it's just another sort of copy paste. And that helps keep me organized. I used to do all of that with 3x5 cards, because, and I did that especially with my dissertation, because when you're writing 300, 400 pages, a document like that gets pretty darned unwieldy. Yes. And because back when the earth was still cooling and I was writing my dissertation, footnoting software was just not as good as it is now. And I was wasting so much time trying to learn how to use it that I was losing time I could have been spending writing or complaining about writing.
Yeah. So two things on this for me. I have, the way, by the way, I reuse quotes that I've used before as I go find the paper, the Word version of the paper and copy and paste it into the new one.
I do that as well now again, but
I think, which goes to the point that another advice for young academics is organize your files in a way where you don't waste time finding things, right? Every minute that you go, this isn't where I think it should be, is a failure of your filing system, right?
This is my great shame.
Yes. And so mine's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So there's that. But the other thing I was going to say is again, writing books is different, but when I wrote with the books, what I did was create a master bibliography file from all the stuff I cited in those books. And so frequently now when I go to construct a reference list for a paper I'm writing today, I just still have those files, right? And I'll just go back and copy paste from those and move them into, if it's older stuff. The problem is that those are, kind of out of date, right? They get out of date. So I find myself, again, even with references, going into an old Word version of a paper and copying and pasting if I know I cited it there, right? Moving there. If I were really being the best version of myself, at some point in the past, I would have combined all those files and made a giant master bibliography file. But that's a pretty big upfront investment. I'm not sure it's worth it.
Yeah. But I think, if I were starting out, as a grad student right now, I would probably find a way to do that. Though, I worry about getting too reliant on a particular piece of software because like all that stuff we had on floppy disks, right? Because it was going to preserve it forever and we were always going to be able to get to it, right? Good luck with that.
I'm also getting a little shaky sitting here looking at Sarah's Gmail and all the unread messages. They're mostly junk, but like 2,000 unread messages in one folder.
Wait, that's just
I know it's mostly
that's
junk.
A junk mail.
Doesn't matter. Still makes me shaky.
This is the number that counts.
Yeah, I know.
Inbox 18. That's 18 not too
fine.
bad for a
That's
Thursday.
Good. That is good.
That's fine.
Do you have anything else you'd like to add? I could go on. To be honest, the reason why I'm asking.
Apparently, yes, we could do this forever.
I know. The reason why I'm asking is because I'm looking at my battery and it's 7% and my recharger is downstairs.
That makes me nervous too.
It's red. It started red at something like 12 and I'm looking at it in the corner of my eye thinking, okay, when it gets to 5, it gets a little bit glitchy.
Well, is there anything that you thought we would talk about that we didn't talk about that you'd like to do?
Yeah, you've got 2% left. I won't put a time on it, put a percentage on it. Now it says low battery.
All right.
No, I could run down and get it. I'm cool with that.
Well, it's up to you. I think we've done about 90 minutes.
We've certainly done. I think the writing chunk.
Yeah. We have. Yeah. Because we touched on the Facebook stuff and social media and how that could get you going in terms of your content or feedback or discussion going and that type of thing. I'm not sure if there's anything, if we left anything out. Because we looked at referees and writing styles and routines and that type of thing and tips.
Yeah. And some, as ever, more digression than actual context, but some digressions into how projects happen and
Cool. And Steve, you're all good anyway, are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. doing well.
Good.
He's doing really well. Back to full power.
Yeah,
great. Delighted for you. Yeah, I'm sure it was tough going, in terms of getting the diagnosis and then having to deal with that. And I'm really glad to see you, back to yourself on Facebook and giving out as ever, as much as ever.
I got too much to do. I don't have time for cancer.
Exactly. Good. Look, I really appreciate both of you coming on. This is quite experimental for me, hence the green screen behind me. So I just picked that up yesterday, and I might put an image in the background. Who knows? Who knows? Or might just leave it green because it's Irish, isn't it?
Why not?
It'd be good for St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah. But no, it's great to talk to you, and it's always fun for us when we get a chance to do stuff together.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I was delighted that the two of you jumped at the chance anyway when I put the offer out there. Yeah. Maybe we'll do it again sometime in the future.
Please, absolutely.
Yeah. Great.
And next time we're over on that side of things, we're gonna look you up.
Find you.
We'll find you. We'll buy you.
Let me know and I'll fly the other way. No, only joking. Yeah.
We got to do this, man.
We'll get you over here sometime or something.
Cool. Nice one. Great. And again, as always, you're both economic rock stars, and I appreciate you taking time out on this and learning. I honestly learned a lot from you. Check out the episode, economicrockstar.com/Sarah and Steve, because after all, it is the Sarah and Stephen show. Maybe this will become a weekly thing. Okay, all the best then.
Hey, thank you,
Sarah.
Sarah.
Right, thanks so much.
All the best. Bye.
Yeah,
thanks very much. Bye. Economic Rockstar is a free podcast that does not exclude anyone from listening as long as they have a device to listen, download, or stream. I have many listeners from all parts of the world, and I truly am pleased to know that the Economic Rockstar podcast unites all of you through the common theme of economics. I strive to commit to releasing an episode each week and aim to develop Economic Rockstar into much more than just a podcast. Patreon is a platform that gives you, the listener of the Economic Rockstar podcast, the opportunity to express your appreciation of the show by committing a financial reward for as little as $1 a month. Patreon allows me, the creator of the Economic Rockstar podcast, to be rewarded and paid by you so I can continue with the running costs of the show and to reinvest and expand the podcast into other platforms or mediums in the future. To find out more on how you can help the Economic Rockstar podcast and have your name added to the supporters list on my website, please check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Economic Rockstar or visit the supporters page on the Economic Rockstar website. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.